what you wanna believe, then you can leave it up to me, and I'll give you the key. It's easy. Just keep on hopping, keep on rocking, and don't start stopping. It's everything you need just to want to see. And if you wanna make it better, you give it to me. I'll embrace it. I believe for you, you wouldn't believe what I see in you. So don't stop. Don't let the dream drop hop. Hold up and make it lovely, make it real, and make it yours. Don't stop.
All right, Jeff, I'm super, super excited to have you coming on the show. Finally, we've tried to connect a couple times, but we're both busy people. And so it's hard sometimes.
It is. Yeah. This is like maybe like half a year in the making, I think.
Yeah, or maybe possibly more. I'm not sure. But anyway, so to give a little background to our listeners, you are basically what I would call like a functional health coach / you do bodybuilding / you do kind of everything. But there's a group of you guys that are all really awesome. I've taken classes from every single one of you. Probably all. I think I've taken every one of yours actually. And tons and tons of lab work classes. People know I love lab work. It's really one of my favorite things. And out of all of them, you are still one of my favorites as far as the go-to with the lab work. So I've been dying to get you on the show to talk about that, because I could get on and spout stuff off by myself, but it's always so much more fun to do it with somebody else.
Yeah. You have someone to bounce ideas off of.
Yeah.
It's not only a conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so I first want you to kind of tell my listeners a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what got you into this.
Yeah. So, like you said, my name is Jeffrey Sue. I own a coaching business called First Call Out Fitness. It was founded in bodybuilding, hence the name First Call Out. But I work with, myself and my assistant coach, Laura Goldstein. We work with, a wide variety of clientele across the spectrum of fitness. So we have bodybuilders, we have women who are trying to have their, first healthy pregnancy, or women trying to get their, postpartum weight off, people with thyroid issues, gut issues, adrenal issues, you name it, we've seen it. I've been coaching now for over 10 years. My formal education is actually in business. I have an MBA. I worked about 8 years in finance, in corporate and retail finance. And, I'm just passionate about fitness. So I'm very much self-taught, although I do hold certificates from ACSM and AFPA for training and nutrition.
Awesome. Well, and that's kind of the hard part, right? You turn into this nutrition / hormone / everything guru, right? And you have to be multifaceted in this industry, for sure. Yeah. And it's so funny. People are always like, who are you certified through? And I'm like, okay, well, I do hold certifications, but here's the deal. I don't think I learned shit from any of those, right? I learned it all from diving down crazy rabbit holes constantly. And then it's crazy. The more you know, the more you don't know. And it could almost drive a person that's into this kind of stuff insane.
Yeah. It's a fine line that we have to walk, because the pure personal trainer in the gym can only go so far. And that model, I guess, or that approach has left a lot of people hanging. But at the same time, you get into this functional stuff and you're like, God, should I just go back to like school and become a doctor or something? Do I need to go to med school? And it doesn't have to be that in-depth either.
Mm-hmm. Well, the funny part is I actually looked into that, because I was like, okay, I'm just going to become a nurse practitioner. This will be way better. And I just going to finish off my education, right? Well, when I started pursuing that, one of my close friends is a cardiologist, and he was actually moving out of cardiology and into health coaching, because he's just like, I can't deal with the typical medical climate anymore. And so we became really good friends, and he was like, do not become a doctor or a nurse practitioner. He said, first of all, the malpractice insurance you're never going to make your money back if you're flying solo and you're not in some kind of group. And he said, secondarily, you're actually responsible legally so much more once you add those letters to your name. So he was like, don't do it. Keep doing what you're doing and just learn as much as you can and stick with what you're doing. So I was like, okay, you convinced me, buddy.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the gripe with that I hear from my clients who are doctors, physicians of all types, is the insurance. They're not making as much money as the general populace would think a doctor would be making, and everyone needs to earn a living. So a lot of them are moving into coaching, or sort of like doing it on the side, parlaying their medical knowledge into health coaching. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's all cool stuff, but today I'm hoping to chat at you a little bit about lab work, because it's such an important thing, and people don't realize that the standard panel that they're having run in their allopathic medical practice is typically lacking a lot of the things that they need actually in order to optimize their health. So I'm sure you've heard, as we all have, right, in this industry, is like, I don't feel good, but my labs are normal or within range, all those things. And when people like you and I start diving down that rabbit hole, we start to see all sorts of things on labs that we can use to optimize someone's health or even weight loss journey.
Yeah, I think the first thing for your listeners here, or anybody listening to this really, is to not gaslight yourself, in the sense that if you feel off, if you've been feeling unhealthy, you think that there's something wrong with your body, don't let someone tell you that, oh, you're crazy, you're overthinking it, or whatever. I think, yes, there are some people who are hypochondriacs, okay? But for the most part, for the most average, people out there who think there's something wrong with their body, it's worth investigating. The other thing is that, lab work and what doctors run typically is really the bare bones, CBC panel, complete, blood cell count. You're running TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. It doesn't really tell too much. And the ranges, most people are going to fall within the range because the ranges are so generous. So it's kind of like if you have a kid and, he comes home with a C- on his biology test, and the teacher's like, oh yeah, it's normal. But I mean, of course you want your kids to be getting A's, you want your kids to be doing well in school. So it's the same thing, it's a range. But does being at the bottom of the range, is that a good thing? No, it's not. So
no, we don't want to just barely pass our classes. I mean, if you go seek out a doctor, you're not going to want the D- doctor. You're going to want the A+ one.
Right? Yeah, that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But I just want people to know that, just because the labs say normal doesn't mean you should ignore how you're feeling. You should feel great, and then wherever the labs are, they are. But just keep those two things in mind.
Awesome. Well, and that I want to just caveat this with, as you know, we are not doctors. We're just people that nerd out on all of this stuff and have made it our life purpose to understand it well. So hopefully we're able to help as many people as possible, at least bring valuable information to their own practitioner and understand themselves better so that they can, help their health journey. So, so diving into that, when you look at lab work, what do you like to order and why?
Okay. Yeah, I think for the most part, most people will benefit from at least getting their sex hormones checked. So for both men and women, this includes testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. I would also suggest getting insulin tested, your fasted insulin, along with your A1C and your fasted blood glucose. That covers, the whole insulin sensitivity or resistance sector of lab work, which some people may have heard of, resistance and sensitivity. And then I would also get TSH, your thyroid stimulating hormone. I would get T4, free T4, correction there, free T4, free T3, and maybe cortisol, fasted cortisol. To check how your adrenal function is. I think if you start there, and then of course you get the CBC panel, which comes standard, that's enough to start.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So when you get into this, let's talk about hormones, especially in females first, because I think that's important. A lot of women will come to me and they'll be like, yeah, I had my hormones done, here they are. They don't realize that if you are before menopause, right? Or there's other the hormones in your cycle fluctuate based on the time and the month that you're at. And there's actually an optimal time of the month to get those labs drawn in order to kind of get a better picture of what's going on. So can you dive into that a little bit with us?
Yeah. So for women, you want to get your hormones, your sex hormones tested in your luteal phase, usually around days 19 to 21 of your menstrual cycle. And day one would be the first day of real, heavy bleeding. You're bleeding for about, 3, maybe 5 days, and, going through maybe, 4 to 5 tampons or pads worth of blood, right? So that's day one, you start counting. So, it's important to get it within days 19 and 21 because that's when you ovulate. And when you ovulate, the follicle that releases the egg turns into something called the corpus luteum, which is why the second part of your period is called the luteal phase. And this corpus luteum then pumps out progesterone. So if you get your labs tested before day 19, ovulation hasn't occurred. So you could get a misread and the labs will say that you have low progesterone. Where, if you got it tested between days 19 and 21, that's a better representation of how much progesterone your corpus luteum is pumping out.
Yeah, so that's great information. Now, what happens when you have somebody that is maybe got amenorrhea or they're on birth control? Does that impact the time of month that they need to get their labs drawn?
Yeah, so if you're on birth control, you're not going to be ovulating. You're not going to be secreting progesterone, right? Or if you have any sort of amenorrhea or hypothalamic amenorrhea, primary or secondary, your periods are going to be all over the place or non-existent, right? So in that case, just go whenever. It doesn't matter when you go, because you could be testing other things like testosterone, how low your testosterone is. You could see your LH and FSH is probably going to be very low. In other areas that I mentioned earlier, those can all be tested whenever in your menstrual cycle.
Now, not to dive down a rabbit hole here, but women can also have a bleed without ovulating, correct?
Yeah. So you have anovulatory cycles where, for whatever reason, you just don't ovulate. It could be stress, could be inflammation, but yeah, you could have a period and not ovulate, which is why, conceiving can be a problem for a lot of couples out there where, they're trying to have a baby, but they just can't because they don't have the ovulation taking place.
So is that a scenario where you recommend somebody start also tracking their basal body temperature as well?
Yeah, period tracking apps, there's plenty of them out there. They track, things from, basal body temperature, right? Your temperature usually rises in that luteal phase because progesterone actually it lowers something called thyroid binding globulin. It's a protein released by your liver. So you have more thyroid hormone to be floating around and increasing your body temp when there's lower TBG. But anyways, yeah. So if you're tracking BBT, that's one thing. You can also track cervical mucus. You can track other period symptoms. You can also use past period data, like the dates in which they occurred, to predict your next fertile period if you're trying for baby making. So yeah, there's a lot of ways that you can track.
So why is it important for women to track estrogen, progesterone, testosterone? There's the other ones too, but some of those are the heavy hitters. Why is that important?
Well, it's important because the period is almost like a looking glass into a woman's health. I think from an early age, women are taught that periods are a nuisance and they should be covered up. It's shameful, it's embarrassing. Let's just get on birth control and forget about it, right? But I think if you take the time to nurture your body and understand the hormonal ebbs and flows of progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone, you'll be better able to manage your lifestyle stressors and know when to push your body, when to pull back, when to care for it a little bit more, and not push, the late nights at work or going out drinking every weekend. So it really is a barometer that you can, adjust your lifestyle off of.
Mm-hmm. How about testosterone? I know that's kind of a scary word for a lot of females, right? You say the word testosterone and they think it's like, oh, you only do that if you want to be a bodybuilder, but it actually has a lot of benefits.
Yeah, I mean, mood, sexual health, sex drive, muscle building, fat loss, a lot of it, comes from, having adequate levels of testosterone. And for most women, you want to be anywhere from maybe like 40 to like maybe like 70 to 80 nanograms per deciliter. Obviously, when you're younger, your hormones are going to be higher. It's also a point of contention with, HRT. When women are trying to, replace testosterone in their later years, it's often fumbled by clinics where the testosterone ends up being too high, or they get put on things like pellets. And that can cause a lot of water retention, weight gain, and DHT side effects like acne and hair loss and greasy skin, things like that. So too much testosterone is not a good thing either.
Yeah, and I've actually had this conversation frequently. It is crazy trying to get people into some form of HRT where the clinician is not pushing extreme levels of hormone replacement. It seems like, I think there's a lot of pharmaceutical influence in that too. And I mean, you could elaborate on that if you wanted, but it's so hard because they're like, oh, well, my doctor said, I said, well, if your testosterone gets that high, you're going to start dealing with a lot of stuff that's not good, including like they're putting people that are obese on TRT, high TRT, and then you're adding to the insulin sensitivity problem. So I feel like, but then they're like, oh no, my clinician says it's great and it'll help with insulin sensitivity and it'll do this and it'll do that. And I'm like, okay, well, there is no example in nature aside from some people that have some hyperandrogenism actually having crazy high testosterone like that. It's not healthy, but there's a big push now with this more is better kind of thinking. And it's really, really sad for the patient.
Yeah, there's a lot of miseducation out there on the patient/client side, but also the clinician side, because a lot of the information is outdated. For example, like I mentioned, the pellet HRT route, when women get a pellet for testosterone, their levels almost always are, super high. They fluctuate wildly. There's also a lot of miseducation out there. Like even with men, when men get testosterone replacement, they're told to inject, once a week or once every 2 weeks, and the levels aren't stable. I've seen mistakes where a woman is, thinks that she's taking 5, mgs per week, and she's actually taking 5 tick marks on the syringe per week. And that ends up being, God knows, maybe like 10 times higher than what she should.
Yeah.
So, and then she's wondering, why am I getting acne? Well, it's because you're taking, 50 milligrams of testosterone a week.
I actually just experienced this. I had a client of my own ran out of her cream and she's like, well, my boyfriend just gave me a little bit of his injection and I did it. We ran her testosterone. I was like, how much are you taking? She's like, oh, just a quarter of a cc. Her testosterone was 800.
Oh yeah.
I was like, whoa, we can't do this. No.
Oh, yeah. I mean, short term, you're not going to see too many side effects, but long term, you do that long term. These drugs compound over time and their effects build up over time, right? And on a side note, any amount of testosterone that you take, multiply it by 5, that's what you see on your lab work. So, going back to what I said about how most women should be optimized at between 60 to maybe like 70 or 80 nanograms per deciliter, take that 80 and divide it by 5. And that's how much you should be taking at the most for most HRT cases. So if your labs are showing 200, 300, there's something wrong with your dosing.
And it can be super it can be a good contributor to your mood and your energy levels and your libido and a lot of those things. So women think they're just going to like bulk up if their testosterone levels get into, if they go on HRT or if you start moving their testosterone levels up a little bit, when really they're going to feel so much better and even potentially shed fat better because they are more efficient.
Yeah, the bulking up fear, I just want to clear that up. It's like, yes, testosterone can help men and women bulk up if you eat a lot of food and you train like a crazy person. And I think most women who are looking to just feel better, they're in their 40s, 50s, they're not in there, setting PRs in the hack squat or deadlifting 500 pounds, or shoving 3,000 calories down their throats.
Right.
So the bulking up thing isn't going to happen. The testosterone will make you feel good to a degree. Just be careful not to take too much, because then you'll just get a whole bunch of side effects.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. Well, so that's a good one. Now, I want to kind of dive down another rabbit hole with that one, Jeff, while we're sitting on that subject, because you mentioned cortisol and thyroid, and there are a lot of markers. So I find, and you may find this as well, maybe you can elaborate, but I find most women are overdoing it in some way, shape, or form when it comes to people in like the fitness realm or general population women that start getting into fitness. They think they need to overdo it in order to get results. And so you kind of sometimes see that come back on lab work as adrenal stress. And so that's when you start seeing things like DHEA downregulated and progesterone downregulated and testosterone. Can you kind of elaborate on some of that stuff just a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's all mindset and emotional habit rooted, right? So, humans are impatient in general. We're attracted to shiny new things. We want to go crazy. We want to do 75 hard. We want to do keto. We want to get the weight off fast, even though in reality, if you ask yourself, you haven't really cared about getting the weight off or keeping it off for years. And all of a sudden you want to get it off fast. So, proclivity for, impatient, intense methods, pushes people towards extremes. And they're training 6 days a week. They're doing 2 hours of cardio. They're cutting their calories down. They're doing keto. And all of a sudden they hit a wall, they binge, and then the cycle repeats. So that's why there are people out there who might be listening to this podcast who've been trying to lose the same 20 pounds for the last 7 years. And it's just getting worse and worse. And then they get older and older. And then they have this pressure of time that they're like, oh my God, I'm 40 now. Oh my God, I'm 45. Oh my God, I'm 50. And it just like, it destroys them. That pressure just comes down on them. But if you take a deep breath, just pause and think about, longevity in the sport or the pursuit of fitness, you'll realize that these extremes have done you no good. And a lot of that's reflected on lab work. So you see women with, very, very high cortisol, or they keep pushing it too far and too long, that cortisol starts to plummet and you start waking up feeling like 10 cups of coffee can't even get you out of bed and you're flatlined. That's what we call it as coaches, right? Your sex drive starts to tank. You don't even want your husband to look at you or touch you, and that's when you know that there's something wrong. When your kids piss you off, even when they're, drawing some picture and they're like, hey, mommy, and you're like, oh, I don't even want to see it, you just turn into like, it's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or whatever, right? So you want to avoid that.
Yeah, I've been there actually. So that and all of my listeners probably know that. Like that's where I came from, right? So and that was part of my thing as a coach, is I didn't ever want to put people in that position. I wanted to make sure that they understood that they could do so much more with less.
Yeah. If you're in that situation and you're just impatient, you're feeling pressure, you're feeling anxiety, and you just want the weight off, you just got to just take a deep breath, just stop, reevaluate what you're doing, and then trim things down to something a little more basic and sustainable for yourself. Yeah. And then I promise you the results will come fast if you do that.
So could you explain a little bit what some adrenal issues could look like on lab work then?
Yeah. So, I mean, on lab work, obviously the cortisol, right? You'd see fasted cortisol, either serum, you'd see it really, really high or really, really low. Better ways to test cortisol, honestly, would be a saliva cortisol test. There are a lot of third-party companies right now that are offering that at home, and you literally test your saliva at home, and they'll tell you what your cortisol levels are. You can also get something called a dried urine test, which is, abbreviated as Dutch. And, cortisol is metabolized into cortisone in the kidneys. And so that's why we can observe cortisol metabolism on the Dutch test, keeping in mind that each test point is a reflection of the prior time frame, because urine is voided, right? So then whatever you pee out now is a reflection of hormone levels maybe several hours ago. So just understand that about the Dutch, because cortisol is plotted in a pattern, and usually people do morning, midday, afternoon, and evening. So you need to understand, the time of testing and the time where the hormones were highest when you're looking at that curve. As you mentioned, Connie, there's DHEA, which is one of the androgens in males and females that can get low. Testosterone tends to get low as well. And this is because the ovaries and the testes, and to a degree the adrenals, will prioritize cortisol production, glucocorticoid production over sex hormone production in times of stress. It's simply the body's mechanism of self-preservation, and we're putting off more metabolically expensive processes like reproduction. So that's why your sex drive tanks when you're stressed.
Makes a lot of sense. I like that. So let's kind of back up. We touched on all the sex hormones and stuff like that, and we even kind of touched on cortisol a little. Let's kind of dive into the thyroid, because that's another thing that I see is frequently not optimal on people with their lab work.
Yeah. So TSH is, like I said earlier, thyroid stimulating hormone. And it's a hormone that, controls basically what, the thyroid outputs in terms of, the actual hormones T4 and T3, which act on your cells, every cell in the body, really. The thyroid controls like the rate at which your nails grow, your body temp, your hair, how often you poop. The thyroid controls all that. So if you see a high TSH, that's usually not a good thing. High means hypo, means low thyroid hormone, because your body can sense how much hormone is floating around. So if it's low, it sends a signal to your brain, and your brain then tells your thyroid, hey, let's kick up production. So the TSH goes up. Now, if you have a lot of thyroid hormone, like say your doctor put you on, Cytomel or, levothyroxine, T4, and you're taking too much, you might see a very, very low TSH. And so TSH, you want to be right around like a 2 to 2.5, kind of like a Goldilocks thing, right? Not too hot, not too cold. And so TSH is often used as a barometer as doctors. That's why they run it all the time, to quickly check, where that feedback loop is, where that balance is in your thyroid hormones.
So how come well, we know that this is one of the ones that they only check, right? You just said that, but how come sometimes that number is normal, yet the thyroid is not outputting when it needs to downstream?
Yeah, so that's because of inflammation. So inflammation, think of inflammation as like if you have a lock that's old and rusty and dirty, and it's all gunked up and you can't get the key into it to open the door. Think of hormones and their respective receptors as such a relationship, where the receptor is the lock and the hormone is the key. So if you have inflammation going on, let's say you're very stressed out, you've been eating a lot of, processed foods, you've been drinking alcohol, those send signals like via your gut to your brain, and it triggers a cytokine response. And there's a handful of main cytokines, TNF alpha being one of them, CRP, JNK and IKK complexes, which will downregulate your metabolism and prepare you for stress, basically. And so when you're downregulating the system, what do you turn off first? It's like your thyroid, right? Let's slow down hair growth. Let's slow down skin cell production. Let's slow down GI motility. So what happens when you eat processed foods and drink alcohol and are stressed out for a long time? Your skin starts to look like shit. Your hair falls out. You can't poop. You can't sleep. And that's basically the physical symptomatic manifestations of subclinical hypothyroidism.
Absolutely. And that's kind of a thing. I've said this before, and I probably have some hate over it, but you hear a lot of people saying they are overweight because they have a hypothyroid, but sometimes they have to think I may have a thyroid problem because I'm overweight. What came first, the chicken or the egg, right? It's so easy. It's so easy to blame it on the thyroid, but how about your poor eating habits and lifestyle choices leading up to that had caused the inflammation that caused that thyroid to downregulate?
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of people, this is like maybe like another debate or rabbit hole or conversation, but being fat in itself or having body fat in itself doesn't necessarily mean that you have metabolic dysregulation. Because if you think of women with lean PCOS, they look healthy. They look lean, right? They're not fat, but they're metabolically dysregulated. So, you can only look at it one way, going one way, meaning that body fat is often a physical manifestation of metabolic diseases or metabolic processes not being optimized. But not the other way around. Being obese doesn't always mean that you're unhealthy.
Well, yeah, and that's another true story, right? Because how many people, especially in this realm of social media that I love so much, right? How many people, I mean, I have a client that's in love with this macro coach online that eats nothing but dog shit food, right? And she's a figure competitor, and she's lean, and she's got the big belts and all that, like 20, year round, right? And I'm like, listen, that just because that person's macro counting and says she's healthy based on a manifestation of what the outside looks, I would love to see her lab work. They might be fine. Who knows? But there are so many people out there in the fitness realm where that those labs are more than likely got some major issues going on. Those people aren't they're not telling the people online they don't have their period. They're not telling them about all these other GI issues and chronic diarrhea. They're not telling them about any of that stuff. They're just, they're just telling them. Yeah.
Yeah. As coaches, at least, I can speak for myself here that I've seen a lot of these Instagrammers and, fitness, people who have severe health issues, but nobody would ever know. And nobody really cares to ask because they just want to look a certain way. But the truth is completely different.
Right. Absolutely. Well, so that was a fun rabbit hole to dive down. But so when the thyroid starts to downregulate, there's a couple different things, right? So you see maybe that the overall function is not optimal, beginning with T4 being low, and then downstream we see effects with that. Or there may be someone that is generating enough T4, but it's not converting. So can you walk us through some of that?
Yeah. So T4 is, let's just call it like a parent hormone. Okay. And then T3 is the more active. So T4 is like the parent reserve hormone. Then the body will convert T4 into T3, which then acts on the cells. In order to convert T4 to T3, you need things like magnesium and zinc and B vitamins. You need to be healthy in order to have this process take place. And that often happens in the liver and the gut. So if your gut isn't healthy, meaning that you're not digesting well, you're not eating enough fruits and vegetables and things like that, that conversion will be impaired and you won't get as much of a bang for your buck with T3. Going back to what needs to be tested for thyroid hormones too, there's also, I may have mentioned TBG with the progesterone thing, but TBG can be increased under stress. You could have more production of reverse T3 instead of free T3 in situations of stress and inflammation. And think of reverse T3 as like the brakes, and then T3 is the gas. So if you want to get your body going, get pooping, you don't want to hit the brakes, you want to hit the gas. So those things can affect the thyroid as well. Of course, there's diseases like Graves and Hashimoto's, which are autoimmune diseases where the body is attacking the thyroid cells. And there are tests you can run. One of them is TPO-AB, thyroid peroxidase antibodies. And then there's another one called TGAB, thyroid globulin antibodies, which would signify an autoimmune condition.
Now I have a little theory here and I'd love to get your piece on it, but you're seeing a lot more people, obviously, especially women, pop up with autoimmune disease, but now you're also seeing it in men more frequently. And I mean, there's a lot of stressors, right? But I mean, if you look back at the studies, men are less susceptible to autoimmune disease, and they're starting to link that to testosterone. But and people are like, oh, well, men have it now too. But if you think about it, you're running a lot of male labs now, and their testosterone is totally down in the crapper. And so I have this little theory that you're seeing more and more men with it because their testosterone is not optimized.
Yeah, I don't know the any clear direct connections between sex hormones and autoimmune diseases. There are a lot of research. There's a lot of research going on there. But doctors and researchers haven't even come up with a clear connection. What people do know is that women, for Hashimoto's, for example, women are far more likely to develop Hashimoto's simply because of the way estrogen and progesterone interact with the thyroid. How the menstrual cycle is constantly changing, and then you add in birth control and things like that. It's a mix that people are trying to unravel, but we know that women in general are more susceptible to autoimmune diseases. I feel like, our industry in general right now is now moving on to the immune system. 2019 was all about the gut, all about sex hormones. The functional coach sort of was birthed in 2019, I would say. And, everyone was making posts about gut health in 2020, 2021. And now, some people are leading the charge about autoimmune issues. And I would just caution everybody to stop and, again, take a deep breath and think that just because you're tired, you have weight loss resistance or whatever, doesn't mean that you have an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune diseases are very, very clearly defined and marked in the medical community. You can test for them. You would know if you have psoriasis or Crohn's or whatever else, Hashimoto's. So don't fall for any quackery out there.
Right. It's kind of, so when I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, my TPO was 1100.
Yep. That's a clear indicator.
And it was quite interesting because I had been complaining of a problem since I was 18 years old, literally. I was an athlete, ran track and field, did all the things, right? Never recovered, always felt like dog shit. And they were like, oh, well, maybe you have mono, or maybe you have this, or maybe no one ever checked my TPO, right? Until finally I found I was having these problems. I was doing tons of bodybuilding shows, because that's healthy. And I was having these problems, and I couldn't get a doctor to help me. They were like, you look great, right? And I'm like, oh, I don't feel great. I finally found a doctor that was a bodybuilder. So I could go to her and be like, hey, here's what's going on. And she had identified it immediately. And I'm sure it was extra flared up because of competing and stuff like that. But I'm pretty sure I probably had it a very long time, right? Which who knows? I'm always curious when it happened. But anyway, yeah. So that was a clear indicator that there was definitely a problem, right?
It's just one of those silent things that, doctors aren't going to test you for TPO-AB or TJB. Like I said, they run TSH, maybe free T4. That's it, if you're lucky in your CBC. But yeah, that's why it's so important for people to be aware. And, this podcast, this episode here will help with that awareness that, there are other things that people should look into and push for testing and ask their doctors to explain to them if they happen to not feel right and suspect something is off. Don't just take no for an answer and say, oh yeah, you're fine, you're normal, don't worry about it. It's unfortunate because a lot of the clients that I coach or meet are women in their 40s and 50s, and they're often put on antidepressants. They're put on a whole bunch of PPIs or other drugs for constipation, diarrhea, whatever, because nobody's ever, educated them about, birth control or any of these other supplements and, things that they've been doing in terms of their exercise, over-exercising, that led them to, the point today. So it's our job as coaches or practitioners or whatever to sort of unravel that history and figure out where to take them next.
Yeah. So you brought up the liver back there, Jeff, as far as being involved in the thyroid process. So when you're looking at people's labs, are there labs that you look at that show the liver health, and is there a range that you like to see those labs in?
Yeah. Well, liver, you're mainly looking at ALT and AST. So those two are your classic liver enzymes, liver markers on the serum lab test. And I want people to think of ALT, the L to stand for liver, and the ASTS standing for other stuff. Okay. So ALT is liver specific. So if your liver's inflamed, it's injured, you drank too much or whatever, you'll see ALT. And you know that that's all liver. Okay. If you have AST elevated, it could be your kidneys, it could be your heart, it could be something else. Okay. So that's other stuff. So doctors take into consideration ALT, AST. They also take into something called LD and GGT as well. But for the purposes of your listeners, pay attention to ALT. You don't want to see that higher than maybe like a 35, 40. The labs will vary in range. Some are less forgiving than others, meaning that they want to see ALT and AST in the 20s. I've seen labs allow them to go up to 50. So it's interpretive, right? There's a subjective tone to this as well. But if you see liver enzymes in the hundreds or 300s, you know that there's something wrong.
Now, what hand does the liver play in sex hormones? Because that's another big piece, right?
Yeah. So the liver is responsible for, phase one detoxification in terms of estrogen. And what that means is that, estrogen, is an umbrella term, right? Estrogen stands for, there's E1, estrone, there's E2, estradiol, there's E3, estriol, and there's even an E4, which is produced by the fetus, actually, in pregnant women only. But anyways, the estrogens, they go down different pathways of metabolism and they become metabolites of estrogen. So it gets broken down, basically. And the liver is responsible for a process that binds these estrogens so that instead of being fat soluble, they become water soluble because it's pushed out via the urine. So there's a conversion that takes place to allow estrogen to be pushed out into the urine. And that's what, phase two and phase one and phase two detoxification means. You guys may have heard of like methylation or conjugation, these terms. It's just basically talking about detoxification. So the liver plays a huge role in eliminating excess estrogen, because if you have excess estrogen or too much estrogen and you're estrogen dominant, you could have, sore breasts. You could have, poor sleep. You could, have heavy bleeding, erratic periods, because estrogen is responsible for building the uterine lining. So you get clots in your periods. You're bleeding through, 8 tampons instead of the standard, 5 to 6 max per period. So that's where the liver comes into play.
Is there also a relation with the liver health and cholesterol?
Yeah. So the liver is responsible for metabolizing cholesterol as well. So cholesterol, we can think of cholesterol as, the fat in the food that we eat, that manifests itself as triglycerides in the blood. But your liver can also manufacture cholesterol, because cholesterol is very, it's neuroprotective, because our brains are, 70% fat. And so you'll see this phenomenon on the lab work of contest prep athletes, where after a prep and they're eating so healthy, they're not eating any fat at all, but yet you'll see LDL and triglycerides completely elevated. And you're like, how is this possible? It's because their own livers are producing it. And so we know LDL and triglycerides aren't that great, right? We have certain limits that we want them under. And HDL is the good cholesterol that we want, at least 40, 50 or higher. So think of HDL as like a street cleaner in your vessels and arteries that brings the LDL to your liver for conjugation, methylation, going from fat soluble to water soluble, right? And then that gets excreted.
Yeah, and I think cholesterol gets demonized, the word cholesterol, right? But they don't realize it plays an important role in like sex hormone production and stuff like that too. So it's also something that we need.
Yes. Yeah, you make a good point there that I forgot to mention, that cholesterol is the first building block of the hormonal chain. So you have cholesterol, you have pregnenolone, you have, the androgens, progesterone, estrogens, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so it's also important, and another good thing to look at our ALT and our AST on our lab work. And then that kind of put us into the cholesterol area, which we just discussed. Now, there are lots of people out there talking about cholesterol and about the fact that having a higher LDL is not necessarily a scary thing with regards to other labs if they are brought into the equation. Can you elaborate on any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about LDL, it's more important to look into particle size. What those particles of LDL look like, because if you're mainly like large particle, it's probably less of a cardiac risk than if you were smaller particle, which think of like these are literal like bits of fat, tiny microscopic pieces of lipids that are floating around your vessels, and you could get a clot if these are tiny hard bumps, right, of fat, versus the fluffy stuff can be broken down by vigorous exercise, changing the viscosity of blood flow, and via, HDL, which you can boost by eating more omegas or following a Mediterranean style diet. So, cholesterol, there's a standard that you don't want to be over 200, but, I've seen people like in the 220s, 230s. That's still fine, if their HDL is good.
And in those cases, are you looking at things like ApoB or CRP or anything like that?
Yeah, not the first one that you mentioned, but CRP I look at. I don't test any of the other inflammatory markers like the TNF alpha, the JNK and IKK complexes. But CRP, there's two types, right? There's regular and there's HS, which is high sensitivity. Either one is fine. They use high sensitivity more so for assessing cardiac risk. Yeah.
So in that's one good inflammatory marker you can kind of take a look at too sometimes with people. What's another one? I know ferritin is one that a lot of us like to take a look at. Is that something that you're looking at as well?
Yeah, ferritin usually comes with the CBC. But either way, ferritin is basically bound iron. And so, iron is obviously necessary for thyroid hormone function, production. If you're low on iron, you could be anemic. We get a lot of iron through food, though. Thankfully, if you're living in a first world country, you're probably not going to be too deficient. But ferritin usually will get increased because the body will sequester and bind up iron and store it away, because bacterias and viruses love to feed off of iron to proliferate and grow. So as a defense mechanism, the body will sort of storehouse iron as ferritin.
That's a good one. So we'll kind of maybe touch on white blood cells and neutrophils and lymphocytes. So I'm not sure if that's something that you're bringing into your knowledge. I'm sure you take a look at them, but now there's more and more. You're hearing more and more about underlying low grade infections that aren't being identified by practitioners. Is that anything that you have gotten into?
It definitely is. I mean, there's not much that you can change about the white blood cell or the neutrophils and lymphocytes. These cells that attack invaders in the body, right? The immune system. But clients who have things like they had mono, or they have HSV1 or HSV2, the herpes virus, or they had COVID, right? So these are all things that could trigger an autoimmune issue. So these are things that you need, people need to be asking their clients, in their intake forms. They should be asking about these sort of viruses that people could have encountered, even like chickenpox. People had chickenpox, or Epstein-Barr, Lyme disease. These are all very, very common, and they absolutely can trigger an autoimmune flare up down the line.
Have you heard anything about also, I know there's some people out there talking about, I like to bounce these things off of you, so it's kind of fun. People talking about elevated neutrophils being associated with like SIBO infections and stuff like that.
Yeah. Of course, yeah. I mean, like your gut has its own immune system as well. I mean, see that on either the Genova or the GI map, and it's usually the secretory IgA. And the colostrum will kind of indicate immune function or inflammation in the gut. Calprotectin is another marker for that, or fecal occult blood. I think it's like occult-FIT on the GI map. But yeah, if you have an active gut infection, you have SIBO, you have any sort of dysbiosis, overgrowth, Giardia, H. pylori, Candida, any of that stuff, you could see some, elevation on your CBC as well, showing increased immune activity. And if you got a GI or a Genova test done, you'd probably see increased secretory IgA activity.
Awesome. I always like to hear what you have to say about that stuff. So that's great.
Yeah.
Well, did we miss anything, Jeff? Is there something else that you think needs to be covered, or did we touch on everything today in our chat?
I think we did this was a very, very smooth and very, very comprehensive conversation. You're a great host, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
I guess my only imparting message here is like, this may sound over the top and complex to a lot of people, and that's totally fine. But just remember that the core message here is to don't gaslight yourself. If something's wrong, ask questions until you find answers that satisfy you. Don't be afraid to ask for tests and find someone who can help you interpret them, not replace your doctor, but health coaches like myself, like Connie, countless others out there who are educated and willing to help. They're all great resources. At the end of the day, remember that stress, inflammation, and insulin resistance are going to be the core drivers of every problem you can even think of in this arena of health and fitness. And those are all things that are rooted in lifestyle decisions and lifestyle habits that you may or may not be aware of. So, and a lot of that stuff is in your control. So don't get lost in the high end details, the peak of the pyramid. Work the base, and you'd be surprised how far you can go.
I love it. Well, if people want to reach out to you and talk to you about anything like this, or do a consultation, or become a client, or just look into your stuff, how do they find you?
Yeah, mainly on Instagram at First Call Out Fitness. I have a website, www.firstcallfitness.com, or just look me up on Facebook, Instagram, Jeffrey Sue. You can find me. Yeah.
And are you still selling class recording packages and stuff like that?
Yeah. I still have that bundle of classes. It's like 7 classes. It's over, 14 hours of learning plus all materials. It's $500. So
I heavily recommend that too. That might sound like a steep fee for some, but these, you get insane value. And this, I think you educate in such a way that if somebody is really having an extreme struggle with their health, if they were to just take a few of your classes, maybe even just like a lab work one or a stress one or cycle syncing, whatever it may be, it's going to help them further educate themselves so they can advocate for their health as well. So that's another option if for some reason they can't do custom coaching with people such as you and I.
Definitely a great option. Yep.
So awesome, Jeff. This has been a amazing conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.